Hello and welcome back to yet another exciting week on the stock market. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss the eighth wonder of the world. I will walk you through some of the financial news for this week, then we take a look into my portfolio, and finally I will answer some questions which I have received from the audience. So why am I all of a sudden speaking about an eighth wonder of the world? Well, I just made a simple Google search about the eighth wonder of the world. And this is the first result which came up. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it, earns it. He who doesn't, pays it. So the reason why I bring the eighth wonder of the world up is I entered into a debate where someone phrased the question, what was the deciding moment for you that pulled the trigger that made you start investing? And I answered, the moment I understood the power of compounding interest. And then there was someone saying, what do you mean by that? So I thought maybe it would actually be relevant to show it here with an example. I have actually illustrated this previously in my episode called The Snowball, but just to do it once more, the power of compounding, if we, instead of looking at a snowball, say we start with a snowflake, then you add some force to it, then that snowflake turns into a snowball. At some point, if you keep adding momentum to this, that snowball can turn into an avalanche, which actually will become an unstoppable force. It's just a matter of time and how much force you add to it. So if we start with a small investment and say that we can add $100 a month, sure, the first couple of years you are not going to make that much money from it. But as time passes, it will actually become an unstoppable force. And this, keep in mind, this is starting with a small amount and putting a small amount aside. You often hear people saying, I have no chance of becoming rich. I really like the quote from Warren Buffett where he says, I know I'm going to be rich, so I'm not in a hurry to get there. This really illustrates the point of saying, if you are starting small, but you have a long time horizon, then you will eventually get there. So here, $1,000, then you add $100 every month, you have a yield of 10%. So after 10 years, those $1,000 will have turned into $23,000. Of course, you can say you have added $12,000 in additional savings, so you have only gained what? Around $8,000. But if you then go 10 years forward more and go to 2040, then those $23,000 would have turned into $82,000. So now you have added $25,000, so you would have gained $57,000. So you see that number starts to build. It's not linearly, it's actually exponential. So the longer a time horizon you have, the more crazy this goes. Keep in mind, Warren Buffett, he started out with $100. And since he is an exceptionally good investor, he was capable of making 20% a year. And if you make 20% a year, look how those numbers grow. After 28 years, you would have more than $1 million if you started out with just $100 and are only adding $100 more every single month besides what the portfolio is earning for you. It's amazing. So hopefully this comes across as a very convincing argument. And just to put it into perspective, if we take my portfolio, if we go back, then it was close to $72,000 which I have invested. And since I have a plan of investing around $1,000 every single month, then this is how my numbers look. And I think it would be reasonable to assume that I can actually retire once I reach $1 million. So 19 years from now, if I can keep up with a 10% yield a year, in 19 years from today, then I would actually be able to retire. That sounds quite appealing to me. One thing to note here is, of course, this is not just dividends, this is actually all the wealth which you're gathering inside the portfolio. So when you're adding up this number, then it's not just dividends. That was why I'm in my original example used around 4% instead. And then, of course, it looks very, very different, because then it's not in 19 years, then it is in 32 years that I would be able to retire. And the difference, of course, here is also, well, if it is pure dividends, then when you reach $1 million and it's pure dividends, well, then you're capable of actually living just off your dividends. If you can live for $40,000 a year, which I think I can pretty safely assume I can. Whether or not you make it into the million, I mean, even in the case where you, for instance, make it to 400,000, if you should lose your job there, you can actually survive for some month on $16,000, so you're still feeling more secure. So if your portfolio stays as a snowflake, meaning you have never done something and you're not going to do anything, then there's a lot of risk for you in case you lose your job. If you get to, let's say, a snowball level where you're capable of living for some month, or if you're actually capable of making it into an avalanche, which in my case would be $1 million, because I would still be able to save some money on receiving $40,000, meaning complete financial independence. So that was a lot of talk regarding the 8th wonder of the world, but I really truly think that it deserves such a long time, simply because it is the most convincing argument I can come up with. So without further ado, let's head in and look into the news for this week. And what is more important than looking at the unemployment rate in the US currently? So we go into this US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and those numbers which came out on Friday were much better than all the economists has forecasted. So if we go in and take a look at the report, I will spare you for all the details since it's a 42-page long report, but just to highlight, there was 2.5 million people who lost their job in May, and the economists had forecasted around 8 million, so much better than expected. The unemployment rate has risen to 13.3% instead of the expected 20+%. So of course this has a major impact on the stock market Friday. A lot of people regained a lot, or got even more profit if they have invested later than I did. So really positive news here. I will of course include a link in the description below to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The reason for why I'm going to the source and not just sharing an article from the Wall Street Journal or CNBC or Financial Times or some other news medias, I think it's actually quite important that you can go directly to the source, so there will be no political influence from whatever news media you have found. Every time I'm capable of finding the source, I will try and do that, just so people can form their own opinion. I really think that is a valuable lesson to learn as an investor, and also this thing about being curious and trying to learn more. So it was actually quite interesting to read the news this week, since a lot of the economists were out with their forecasts on Thursday for what the unemployment numbers would be in the report which was published on Friday. I can't recall the last time we have seen such a big discrepancy between the forecasted numbers and what actually happened. I mean, when you forecast 8 million and the result is 2.5 million, of course the stock market has to go up severely, since the reality is much better than what was actually forecasted. The next news item that I would like to emphasize is this pandemic emergency purchase program, which was launched by the ECB back in March, where they were willing to buy bonds up to 750 billion euros. Now they have expanded that program with an additional 600 billion euros, and at the same time they have prolonged the program, saying that they will buy bonds until June 2021. So this is again a positive news for the stock market, since this will lift the prices when there is more liquidity in the market. So that covers all the news for this week. Now let's take a closer look at my portfolio. And I mean, it comes as no surprise when we have these two very big news items, which is undeniably positive for the stock market, that my portfolio has regained a lot in value. And I mean, last week I was close to $56,000. Now the value is $64,000, or actually a little above. $8,000 within a single week. Of course, I have added a little extra into the portfolio, but that's $500, so $7,500 within just 1 week. This just goes to show how big a fluctuation there is in the market whenever there is good news or bad news. So perhaps I should have called this episode How I Made $7,500 within a week without even working for it. Perhaps that would have attracted a much bigger audience or more viewers, but that is actually not the point here. The point is there will be big fluctuations in the market, and if you can't handle these big swings, then by all means, then you should consider adding some bonds into your portfolio. And if you still can't handle that your portfolio will go up or go down in value, then you should not be invested at all. But let's take a closer look and see how big the fluctuations has actually been through the life cycle of this, or the lifetime of this channel. So just to emphasize my point, if you look into the lifetime of my portfolio, you can see that there are 11 red circles and 8 green circles for the time when I recorded this episode. And if you focus on episode 8, 9 and 10, you can see that I lost more than $20,000 within just 2 weeks. If you are a new investor, you would probably have panicked and said, I have no clue to what I'm doing. I will just take the loss and get out of this and never touch it again. This is why I try to put such a big focus on why you should invest long term and only consider selling if there's something fundamentally wrong with the business or you have lost faith in the company, because otherwise you wouldn't be around to experience a week which we have just had, where I have regained $7,500. Another important point which can be made here is, usually when you see drops, they are more severe and occur much faster than how you will regain your money. So if you are in the situation as I am in, where you have lost a lot in the beginning, then you should expect it to take a much longer time before you're actually back in positive territory. That is simply just how it is. And if you can't handle that, if your stomach can't take it, then you should simply just invest in ETFs or a fund and then not look at it at all. And as always, we should take a closer look at what I have added into the portfolio for this week. So as I mentioned, I have added $500 into the portfolio. That went with $250 into Bank of America and $250 into Pfizer. And this is, as usual, a mixture of fresh capital and dividends received. So if we go to the dividends tab, we can see that I have already received $56 in dividends. That is from Wells Fargo and from LTC Properties. LTC Properties paid me the usual $6.86. That will be higher next month since I have added more capital there. And then Wells Fargo paid a little less than $50. So this very clearly illustrates that the portfolio is actually starting to do some of the heavy lifting. Because if I have stayed with my usual investment, $250 per week, then the portfolio would have contributed with more than 20%. But since I decided to add even more into the portfolio has only contributed with a little more than 10%. So in the beginning, you have to do a lot of the heavy lifting, but as these snowflakes starts to come more and more together, then they will form the small snowball, then that snowball will grow bigger, and at some point, you will actually have the avalanche. Of course, this takes years, but the more you're willing to put in the beginning, the faster it goes. So one positive news which I have received within my portfolio is that General Dynamics has declared a dividend which is in line with previous. So there is ex-dividend 1st of July, which will be payable 7th of August. So I'm looking forward to receiving that dividend as well. So let's turn into some questions which I have received from the audience. Do you have any specific financial goals in mind when saving, investing, or are you just doing it to have more money? I have multiple answers for that question. So the end goal is to become completely financially independent. But instead of focusing on that goal now, I'm focusing on a lot of much smaller goals, which are much easier to achieve. So for instance, my first goal was receiving sufficient amount of dividends to pay for a Netflix subscription. Then my next goal was to be able to pay for my internet connection as well. And I mean, I have a lot of these small goals listed. So for instance, it will also be a huge goal for me when my portfolio is starting to contribute as much as I'm actually contributing with fresh capital. That will be a major milestone for me, because then my portfolio will be lifting the same as I'm doing. That's really enjoyable to have these small goals, and that keeps me motivated to stay the line or stay the course. And this really goes hand in hand with my second goal. I would like to see more people becoming financially independent, and the best way I can do that is by putting my money where my mouth is, so I'm showing what I'm doing, and hopefully I can share my experience and share my knowledge, and that will help and encourage other people to do the same. Simply because I think we will be better off as a society if there is more people who are financially independent. So that covered yet another exciting week on the stock market. So now you know what the eighth wonder of the world is. You know where to find US unemployment rates. So remember to comment, like and subscribe. And until I see you next Sunday, bye!